Hello, my name is Valdi Ingthorsson, and in this talk I'm going to address can be called the interdisciplinary gap. The idea that there's a gap in the way that people think in the natural sciences versus in the human sciences, which is an umbrella term then for the humanities and the social sciences, roughly. Okay, but not just between them, but also within within the human sciences, between the quantitative and the qualitative research paradigms. I think these ideas about how very different they are is an obstacle to interdisciplinary disciplines such as sustainability studies. Okay, so I want to argue that roughly there is just one way of thinking, but there are certain differences in the conditions under which the different disciplines operate that motivate the difference in method and approach. Okay. Now, why would this be important, for instance, for sustainability studies? Because it's one of those disciplines where you really need information and knowledge from a range of different disciplines, across the whole spectrum, from the natural sciences and technology, from the humanities and the social sciences, etc. Okay. So, for instance, in designing the perfect city or improving on a city, and don't worry about the models here. We don't, it's not a question of sorting out what's the best idea here, but just what kind of research that goes into finding out what a good city should look like. We have to think about where do we want our homes, what should they look like, where should we place the industries, accommodating for travel for workers from home and to the industry, where should the areas of commerce be, of culture, healthcare and education and recreation. We need to fit all this into a sweet little cake, don't we? And it's very clear that if we want to do this, we need to unify our understanding of nature, human and society, and also be able to appreciate what the different disciplines are giving us in a good way. So the policymakers and decision makers, they have to be able to evaluate the knowledge that the different disciplines are giving us. Okay? We can, for instance, perhaps wonder who was consulted in the design of this roundabout. This is the Magic Roundabout in Swindon in the UK, and which is elected on regular intervals as the worst roundabout in the UK. Okay, and has been since it was built in the 1970s. But on the other hand, actually, the roundabout is very effective in distributing traffic, and not a lot of accidents because people drive so slowly through it. So in a way, in terms of the hard data, it works, right? We can really figure out that this works. But at the same time, drivers are terrified going into it. But how do we calculate the amount of let's say, horror to balance out the efficiency? Okay. And that's one of the problems of qualitative research and research in humanities, that the kind of knowledge that it produces is weighted lower than the knowledge produced by the natural sciences. Okay, so basically, you have to answer, who are the decision makers going to call on, right? To illustrate that divide, if we look at the full spectrum of disciplines, well, roughly, and split up roughly according to kind of faculty distribution. Okay, is relevant also to think that technology is actually placed under the natural sciences, typically engineering and so on. Even though, in fact, what the technology disciplines are producing are actually tools that are supposed to serve us, right? And so questions about usefulness, not just functionality, have to do with how people judge it to be useful, right? So a lot of research that's valuable for technology comes actually from the humanities, right? And social sciences, of course. But that's still push that to simplify out of the picture and consider this picture here. And here the idea is that if we think in terms of interdisciplinarity, then there's generally no problem for different disciplines within the natural sciences to work together, exchange information, design studies, and so on. Because even though they have different knowledge about facts on different levels, right, particles and chemical compounds and stuff like that, they seem to be engaged in the same kind of thinking, so they understand each other pretty well. But when it comes to interacting, from natural science and the humanities, things start to get a little bit difficult. And somewhere there in the middle, there is imagined to be a certain divide between research which is typically thought to be hypothetical deductive. You're working with hypotheses and testing them, and it's quantitative and maybe to a certain degree inductive, but maybe not in the same way inductive as the other side is supposed to be inductive also. We'll get to that ambiguity later. But they are also meant to be hermeneutic here on the right side of the divide. Now this cut doesn't go straight, between natural science and humanities, because we also have within the human sciences the divide between the quantitative and the qualitative. So in particular, in the social sciences, you have quantitative and qualitative research. In the health sciences, you actually have both natural science approach, what's the kind of the purely biological part of medicine is very natural science oriented, right? But also in the health sciences, you have the more the humanities approach, okay? Psychosomatic disorders, for instance. Yeah. And it's across this divide that people are finding it difficult to interact and engage, and the knowledge produced from the human side of things, contra the natural science part of thing, tends to be rated a little bit lower, okay? So that's what we want to address. And ultimately the question comes to who you're going to call, right? Who do you listen to, for instance, as a decision maker in urban design or whatever. And here at least it seems that the criteria of scientific quality in the natural sciences and in the quantitative social sciences are pretty clear. We roughly know what's meant by reliability, validity, generalizability. We can provide operationalizations that allow us to quantify how reliable something is, right? So we kind of know what they're saying. Whereas in the qualitative social sciences and the humanities, insofar as you're trying to substitute the quality terms there in the natural sciences, we talk about credibility, transferability, dependability, and trustworthiness. And those that are trained in those disciplines, they do get a grip on what this is. But you can question yourself: do you know what they are? Could you just at the drop of a hat tell people what that's all about? And even for the people who do know, we know that the criteria are more subjective. You have to evaluate in a different way. You can't really quantify it. Yeah. And all of this means that in the end, the natural sciences, sometimes called the hard sciences, they appear to know what they're talking about. They get the facts right, and decision makers will listen to them. Yeah. Whereas in the soft sciences, that's sometimes scornfully described, for instance, as a policy of deep breathing followed by free association. They don't really know what they're doing. Okay. It's all subjective and murky waters there. No facts, just opinion. And then the question is, of course, even though a lot of research is produced, will that, in a way, evidence really count to anything? Okay. Which is perhaps why, things to do with countables, how cost effective it is, how effective in terms of accidents and number of cars and so on. That's all very clear, but do people like it? Less easy to assert. Yeah. Now, the idea about this difference has often focused very much on method, that they're using different methods. So the natural sciences are using the proper method, the natural scientific method, And that's why they know they're talking about and why they get proper evidence on. And on the other side, they're supposed to not really know what they're doing, okay? I think this is all based on a fairly, well, on bad understanding of the conditions under which the researchers are working, okay? And we can start first to consider issues related to what's sometimes called ontology, right? Issues about what there is in the world and what it's like, okay? Every discipline really has a list of entities. These are the kind of phenomena that we're looking at, and that's their ontology. In philosophy, ontology is more broadly understood as basically, an understanding of what kind of entities there are on a much higher level of generality, like substances, properties, relations. And that doesn't tell you too much about the specific side. But if we have a brief look at what the world we are studying, what the different sciences are looking at, we can come up with this list of types of things that we're interested in. And we have, on the one hand, physical matter and its properties and relations and so on, organisms and their functions, and roughly they're just physical stuff with different functionalities and so on. And that's basically what the natural sciences are interested in, what they focus on. Right? Even, like in medicine, if a medical researcher is just looking at cells and biology and not caring about the consciousness in the head of the person that has the cells, they're focusing on the natural science part, right? But then we also think that in this world there is consciousness. I'm sure that you believe that there's consciousness. You have it yourself. You think others have it. They have certain content. You might be tempted to say, well, maybe it's just brain state, electrochemical signals in the brain, so actually the physical. But that's not how we actually understand them, do we? Right? And we think there are social interactions and their behavior by people with intentions and with the ability to make decisions, choices between alternatives, and so on, right? Language and concepts, societies and intelligence. I'm sure you all think that you're very intelligent, right? So, and these are all phenomena that have, at least to a very high degree, mostly really to do with the content of our minds, right? And our abilities, which we believe to be quite special with respect to, for instance, a particle that has negative charge. It has negative charge, so it will repel another particle if it approaches, but it doesn't have the ability to stop and say, I'm bored with being so negative. Today I want to be positive and embrace the other side. That's not going to happen there, right? So really, we have here, I think, a nice divide between the natural sciences and the human sciences in terms of what kind of phenomena are they studying. And the difference here is, on the one hand, you have just the non-conscious matter in all its forms, right? And on the other side, you have phenomena that might be to a great extent actually physical. I mean, we are physical beings, but our behavior is determined not merely by the physical, but also by the mental, right? And that's what the human sciences are interested in. And there are certain interesting differences here, right? And it's possible that these differences have largely to do with our lack of understanding at present. We just don't know yet, okay? But if we look to the merely physical, then at least we think that today, after several thousand years of research into the matter, we think that we know pretty well that physical matter abides by laws of nature. Now, Rani Anjum will disagree with me on that to a certain extent, but she'll agree that physical reality behaves very, very orderly, right? Some would go as long as say it's uniform, it always behaves in the same way, always. Some say, well, usually it does, yeah. But that's what makes it a predictable matter too. And this has certain methodological consequences. It allows you to do a number of things, methodologically speaking. For instance, you can use retest protocols to calibrate measuring equipment. right? Because you make the assumption that this stuff is always the same, has always been the same, will continue to be the same. So if you're doing a measurement and you do repeated measures on the same thing, you know the thing hasn't changed, and if you always get the same reading, you know the measuring equipment is good, right? It's reliable. You don't know yet if it's specific, right? It gives you the correct reading every time. It just gives you the same. So in order to do that, you use method triangulation. Let's say that you wanted to weigh the population, see how much the average weight of the Norwegian population, right? And but you buy a scale from your next door supermarket, and when you measure 10 people, you say, well, maybe this isn't such a good scale. And then you do the retest calibration, take the same person, measure that person 100 times, and then you say, oh yeah, but I always get the same reading, so it's pretty reliable. But is it precise? Well, I get this weight that I know the weight of and put on the scale, and yes, it gives the correct reading, right? So, and that weight has been measured by some fantastically expensive machine somewhere, so I can trust that, yeah? So I test this machine using another that I know to be precise, yeah? And that's method triangulation. But again, it presupposes that you're measuring or observing this stuff that's very regular and stays the same always, yeah? And because it does that, it's also enough for us to investigate very small samples. And from that small samples and what you figure it out about that, you can generalize to everything in the entire universe. Okay? You take a handful of salt, you study it very carefully, you find out the properties of salt, you find out that it dissolves in water at room temperature if it's not salted. And when you figure that out, you know that all salt in the entire universe is going to dissolve that way. You can generalize because you trust that stuff is always the same wherever it is. Yeah? You don't have control groups for studies of salt, right? You compare with other stuff, but that's to see the difference. You don't have control groups for the control group and so on, because that's not required. And that's how we worked out this scientific method for the natural sciences, right? Test of reliability, quantities of generalizability. When we do the statistic or the standard statistics measured or just developed out of that kind of concerns. But if you go to the phenomena that the human sciences study, we're not seeing the same phenomena. We can't make the assumption, like we can do with the physical stuff, that it stays the same always, that it abides by natural laws, especially, or at least if we accept that we have the so-called free will. Right? We can make choices, and other stuff can't do that. We can. Yeah? So we can make, for instance, we can't then therefore do retest calibration. We take 100 people, put together in a room, and let them fill in the same questionnaire 100 times. What will that tell us? It will tell us how good their memory is at best, from how they filled out the first form, because they're not going to rethink the question every time. So we calibrate questionnaires and interview guides and all that in a different way. We just let people try to fill it in, and then we ask them how was it filling it in? Did you understand the questions, and were all the options adequate and so on? And you send the questionnaire to experts, and they say, yeah, it looks pretty good. I think that's pretty good, right? And then we agree, this is pretty good, but we don't have a measure of reliability for this, yeah. Now, can we use triangulation? Well, to a certain extent, we can measure the same thing in different ways, but we always end up with the same thing, though, that part of these phenomena we're interested in, insofar as we're interested in the intentionality of people, what they're doing, is only observable from a first-person perspective. You can ask a person, how much he likes the foreign policy of the Social Democrats, and they will give you a number, perhaps on a scale from 1 to 7. How can you check if that's the right number? Ask again. There's no machine or alternative method can really make sure that the answer is correct. Okay? The triangulation is just not on the charts, not to the same degree. And also because of this, we can't assume that people abide by natural laws. We can't really generalize in the same way. We really have to assume that we're dealing with different groups all the time, and we have to, stratify and do all kinds of things that you don't have to do in the natural sciences. And yet, the natural sciences, or people who are in favor of the natural scientific approach, are demanding of the human sciences that they do the same things as you do in the natural sciences, even though it cannot be done. So that's one way in which you could say the ontology, looking at what the world is like, basically affects the methodology. Yeah. So ontology matters. Let's now move on to the second part, which is, are people using different scientific approaches in the different domains? And the general idea is that the natural sciences and the quantitative social sciences, they are hypothetical deductive. They work in the hypothetical deductive mode. Whereas it used to be believed that empirical research generally was supposed to be inductive. That was the early 20th century idea of the logical positivist. But that's more or less been abandoned for the natural sciences. It's kind of accepted that, well, it's not properly speaking inductive, in ways we will get to later. But since the 60s, the idea has grown that qualitative research is inductive. Yeah, as everyone says. But it's also supposed to be hermeneutic, just like the humanities and all the disciplines that are engaged in interpretation of meaningful phenomena, texts and behavior and so on. Right? So the idea is with qualitative research is a naturalistic, inductive, and yet hermeneutic inquiry. Naturalistic means that we're observing people in the natural environment and figuring something out about them. Yeah. And I'm a bit puzzled by this combination here. Can you combine inductive with hermeneutic? One of the problems is, what exactly do people mean with inductive? Okay. And that's the problem. Let's first find the contrast, which is the hypothetical deductive approach. Okay. And that's a way of combining logic with empirical research. You have a kind of a logical a form of reasoning, which is supposed to be logically valid. Yeah. And it starts really by logic or thinking, right? Conceptual, perhaps. You start with an hypothesis. And in this case, smoking causes cancer. Let's say that is our hypothesis. And the first step is to figure out what are the consequences, right? If it is true that smoking causes cancer, what follows from that? And what we can figure out without really checking is that, well, if that's the case, then smokers should get more cancer, right? Because they're exposed to the causes to cancer. And not only do we realize this consequence, we also now realize, how can we test the hypothesis? Well, we just collect data about smokers and cancer. And if it turns out that, we know this beforehand, then we carry through the experiment. That's where the empirical component comes in. And the outcome of the empirical component gives us the second premise in the argument, which is smokers get more cancer. And let's say that first, right? And then we think, now we have supported the hypothesis. Now we can tell, yeah, it's true. Smoking causes cancer. Now there's a problem here with confirmation, because even though we get the result that smokers get more cancer, it's not entirely certain that the smoking is the cause. It could also be that they generally have a shitty lifestyle. So other factors combined with smoking, yeah. So we get support, but we can't get proof here. However, if we get the result that smokers do not get more cancer, in fact, the non-smokers get more cancer, then the hypothesis is in trouble. And here the evidence seems to be more conclusive that actually, no, it's not the case that smoking causes cancer in that fictive scenario. But you can realize the point here that this is a way of testing a hypothesis to either confirm or disprove them. Yeah. And the important thing, you start with the hypothesis, figure out a way to test it, and then do the observations. Hypothesis first, observation later. Yeah. And then the observation supports or contradicts the hypothesis. Now, so this is the natural scientific approach, and the idea is that in the qualitative research and the humanities general, you don't do this. Instead, there are other ideas about that area of research, which I think are a myth and a legend, to put it provocatively. And I think I identified 3 myths, or arguably myths here. And one is this idea that qualitative research is inductive, and that humanities is inductive, and that there's no testing of hypothesis. But one important thing is that the idea here is that while we don't test hypotheses, we can generate them. We can infer hypotheses to emerge from the data we collect qualitatively. So we don't really operate with hypotheses, but the outcome is hypothesis. Now, another idea which is accepted also by, in fact, those that do work with qualitative research is that we can't really achieve objectively valid conclusions. It's more popular by the critics. Okay? And that's partly because the idea is that the methods are subjective. We don't have this way of quantifying our reliability and stuff. And then again, also the phenomena that we're studying is supposed to be not really objectively real, they're subjective. Okay. Now, there's more to say about that, but there's no time really to do it here. Let's put that aside, having mentioned it. And then the third one is that qualitative research doesn't allow generalizations. So that's, in fact, also a reason for why it can't achieve objectively valid conclusions. Okay. But here, the idea is that the samples are too small. We only interview, 14, 15, 30 people perhaps at the most. But then the argument is, well, that's not really the point. The point is to discover what's unique about the individuals. So we have then the idea that inductive research discovers hypotheses, allows them to emerge, but it doesn't prove them. and it produces information only on the particular cases. And still, the information that you acquire is supposed to, or described as a general pattern, right? So you produce information about, orally we infer hypotheses, but that without presupposing hypotheses. General patterns emerge, but they're only about the particular case, they can't be generalized, and we can provide no quantification or more general solid support of the general conclusion that we reach. That looks a pretty hopeless situation. And if this is going to turn out right, then I can see no hope of the outcome of qualitative research ever becoming a part of the evidence base for anything. It's just going to be loose speculation. It has to be confirmed by the quantitative research before it can be used. And I think that's a horrible reduction of qualitative research, which I'm here trying to work against. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier, the problem here is, what do people really mean by induction? Because it's an ambiguous term. And the most general understanding of induction is that it's reasoning in which the premises of the argumentation, they support the conclusion, but don't guarantee it. And the simplest example I've found in a dictionary actually is this: I saw my girlfriend kiss another man, she's having an affair. We make one observation and then we infer. Okay, and yeah, ordinarily we say, yeah, that's logical, it's plausible. But then we don't appreciate what's logical in properly speaking. Okay, because this is a logically invalid reasoning. Right, because we can say no to the conclusion without denying the premise. Yeah, she kissed another man, but that doesn't not necessarily mean she's having an affair. Right? She might be a spy that's infiltrating an organization, pretending to fancy someone. Right? It's not really having an affair. She just hasn't told me that she's a spy yet. Yeah, but we can explain it away, but it supports it in a way, at least. It doesn't guarantee it. If we want logically valid reasoning, we have to have a situation like this, where you have premises like all humans are mortal. Second premise is Socrates is human. And then there is only one conclusion, which is Socrates is mortal. And we can know there's only one conclusion because if we say, no, he's immortal. then we have automatically not just said no to the conclusion, but also to one or both of the premises. Right? Because if we say, no, he's not immortal, he's not mortal, then either it's false that he's human, because humans are mortal, or it's false that all humans are mortal, because Socrates is a human and he's not mortal. Yeah. So that's what we mean by logically valid. And I can bet you that you never really get, when people say, that's logical, they just mean plausible. And that's not logical in that strict sense. But this is clearly not what I think we should be thinking about in sciences, right? We don't want just bad inferences, really, okay, invalid inferences. But we do want something that supports, but doesn't guarantee, but apparently not all kinds of such inductive inferences, right? Because there are two different kinds. One is where you infer from the specific to the general, right? You make a lot of observations, quantitatively many, right? You see a raven, it's black. You see another raven, it's black. You see 4 million ravens, they're all black. And then you want to say all ravens are black. You want to come with a general statement. And now you think that we have pretty good support. We have quantitatively heavy stuff, right? 4 million observations. But again, this is inductive because this is still uncertain, because there could be a white raven lurking somewhere up in the Andes where we haven't been looking, and only one is enough to show that this is false. Right? And this can't be the kind of inductive reasoning that people are talking about, because we're not supposed to come to general conclusions about that can be generalized, and this is a way of trying to generalize. And the other is this: I saw my girlfriend kiss another man. That's just a premise that supports but doesn't guarantee. But I'm not sure that is the kind of inductive inference we want either. We want the inductive in the sense that we allow hypotheses to emerge from patterns found in the data. And the typical kind of hypothesis that we get then is like all ravens are black. So I'm a bit puzzled about how this can be applied in qualitative research that doesn't want to quantify and generalize, but still find emergent patterns. Now, here's a question mark about inductive reasoning, and that's really, are these really genuinely inductive? Because there's another form of reasoning called abductive reasoning, sometimes called inference to the best explanation. And the problem here is that if induction works, for instance, like David Hume, the philosopher, said it works, then it's basically a psychological or mental quirk. We're just primed to generalize too quickly. The bus comes late one day, comes late again the next day, and then we say, it's always late. And that's just bad reasoning, isn't it? Yeah. And we shouldn't base science on just this quirk we have to be too quick to make general judgment, right? Other philosophers like John Stuart Mill have argued that, well, really, we haven't spelled out all the premises really. There are kind of background assumptions that go into this. The most important being nature is uniform or behaves regularly. Okay, in the light of that, you have a kind of a methodological premise or rule there in the background, which is when you find a pattern, you may have found one of these uniformities. So if you assume that, well, it's uniform and then you go out and watch ravens and none of them are white, 4 million ravens all black. What are the chances of getting that if it was random distribution, all black and white? Yeah. The best explanation is that they are all black, right? And that's an inference to the best explanation and not really a generalization from the specifics to the general. Yeah. And in fact, the other kind of reasoning is of the same kind. If you say, I saw my girlfriend kiss another man, that's not really enough to go to the conclusion, I think she's having an affair. You need to reflect on what background assumptions am I making. And it's really only in a society where it's a general rule that you only kiss people that you're with that you can draw this inference. And if these people are in an open relationship, she wouldn't be having an affair, right? So we're actually searching our minds for what's the best explanation for this particular case. So there is a difference in the sense that on the one hand you're trying to explain a particular case, in the other you're trying to draw conclusions about general patterns, right? But still, both seem to look more like inference to the best explanation, i.e. abduction, when you spell out the hidden premises, if you buy that. Mm-hmm. So, and all of this is trying to undermine the idea that there is really kind of an inductive science going on. In particular, the kind that where the hypothesis or patterns just come to you through from the observations. I've attacking these ideas about these different types of reasoning. They all seem to boil down to roughly the same kind of reasoning, just with the difference in: am I explaining the particular case? Am I explaining the general case? Yeah? But in both cases, it's an inference to the best explanation, but about a single case or a general pattern. Now, another way to criticize this is to just look at how this inductive inference of hypotheses or patterns is supposed to happen, right? By looking at actual data. And here's this is a transcript from a study on the interaction between elderly people with dementia and the staff taking care of them. Okay, and in the first column you have the raw data, so to speak, what they register when they're observing, okay, called the meaning unit. And the first is: she kicks about and hits the care provider when she is putting shampoo in her hair. She tries to push the care providers away. And the first thing you do is that you condense that to smaller text, but without loss. You don't add and you don't lose too much, but you rewrite it so it says basically the same thing: using physical violence when being dressed and washed. And now we're supposed to go further to let the hypothesis pattern emerge, and that's going from the condensed meaning to the underlying meaning. And here we're supposed to interpret, but not on the basis of hypothesis, which is to the hypothesis generated from the data. And there we have: fighting to defend her body zone against intrusion. And I put the question to you: do you find this reasonable? As did they get this idea of body zone from the raw data, or are they applying a concept that they already have onto the data, a hypothesis, if you like? And I'm finding that a more reasonable speculation, because body zone, and if you go further to the sub-theme, that they're bringing in the idea of a personal space. Personal spaces are unobservable, really. You can't see the personal space. You can see how people act, and you can infer that maybe there's a personal space. And the concept of a personal space in research is fairly recent. It's a typical theoretical construct. Now, if we look at the other meaning unit in the same sub-theme, then it starts with: when care providers are in a room, she closes the door from the outside so that the care providers are locked in and she stays outside in the corridor. That's condensed to closing the door between the care providers and herself. And that's interpreted again as: fighting to defend her body zone against intrusion, fighting to protect personal space. And the overarching theme is interaction as a process of respecting and invading each other's privacy. And now, I think, yes, in some ways you can understand that the data supports this conclusion, in some sense. But you can also see that there are theoretical concepts being projected onto it: personal space, body zone, and so on. But is this a situation where yes, this is the only conclusion? And then you really have to know social theory or psychological theory to be able to judge here, because if you have read Erickson and his idea of personal development, then you will know that what the challenges that the elderly face is loss of authority or of autonomy. People start to mistrust them. Their eyesight is gone. They can't drive. Children are forbidding their parents: no, you can't drive anymore because your eyesight is out. You have to be going home. People are starting to make decisions for you, and that's very tangible in an old people's home. So, what about fighting to protect her autonomy? Isn't that just as good or even better interpretation of what's going on here? Okay. And if you consider the text on the lowest row here, the care provider knocks on her door, waits for an answer. That's just interpreted. Short text doesn't condense much. And that's interpreted as asking permission and waiting for answer before entering room. And that's paying respect to physical space. But doesn't it sound better to say this is respecting the person's autonomy? She gets to decide if she gets for people to come in or not. Okay. And now we have two alternative explanations that maybe are really the data is inconclusive of which one is the correct one. But what seems very clear is that the data doesn't give you these patterns. You really have to already have the theory to find the patterns in the data. And that would mean that this is not inductive at all. Another way to see the same thing is, this is again the result, the categories resulting from a qualitative study on adolescents with gluten intolerance. And they figure out that the factors that decide whether you stick to a gluten-free diet or not, they have to do with these factors here: access to gluten-free alternatives, knowledge about what contains and doesn't contain gluten, what kind of social support do you have, in what context are you finding you at the present moment, what do you get symptoms, do you feel that you've done a bad thing eating gluten stuff, or a sensory aspect, maybe everything with gluten tastes yucky. You really want a wheat bun or something, yeah. Now this was supposed to be something that you arrived at inductively. The data told you this. But surprisingly, if you look at other studies, not looking at gluten, but alcohol, difficulties in staying away from alcohol or from narcotics or whatever, then you get basically the same category table, right? And is this a fluke that they find this? My suggestion is not, because these are just well-known factors that it just comes out of our theory of how social science, our social situation works. These are just the factors in a social environment. And you can just exchange sensory aspects of drinking alcohol or taking heroin or whatever symptoms after, okay, social context, all that. It's always the same. So it's not likely that you're getting all these categories just because it's in the data, but rather that the researchers are all getting the same categories because they've read social theory. And they're projecting the theoretical categories onto the data and say, yeah, it's there. That's what we see. And in this case, actually, the researcher who did the study agrees with this interpretation. Now, they realize that, no, this is not inductive at all, but you're forced to say it's inductive because that's how the methodology is supposed to work. And they say, well, it actually doesn't. But are we to revolt against the ideas, general ideas in the research community about this? Now, so we have really a problem that naturalistic inductive inquiry is really generally considered to be not really good position, because you can't really make observations and it automatically tells you something. You're really always interpreting data or observations in light of your background knowledge. You're always, in a way, understanding, putting what you see into the context of your background knowledge to understand what it's saying. And that means that observations are not inductive. And the combination inductive and hermeneutic is really then inductive observation without hypothesis, and hermeneutic is observation or interpretation in light of hypothesis. So it's a complete opposite. So how can you combine the two? So hermeneutics is about the interpreting, and this is just a further illustration of the point that we don't really observe things. We don't observe meanings, for instance, in particular. The meaning is hidden. That's really why it says in the table here, condensed meaning unit interpretation of underlying meaning. It's the hidden meaning, okay? And we can illustrate by just saying that there's a difference between meaning and expression. If you're out hitchhiking in Northern Europe, you'll probably, you do the thumbs up sign, can I have a lift, right? But this doesn't intrinsically mean, can I have a lift? Because if you do this in Italy, you won't get lift. Nobody will give you a lift because this means up yours in Italy. Same expression, different meaning. And you have to know the code for interpreting the meaning because it's hidden. So in Italy, you do like this. You wave to cars and that means, can I get a lift? And in if they do that in Sweden, they just think you're a jolly fellow. Hi, 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 hi. They don't give you a lift. Yeah. So that's why we need interpretation. And that means really that there's no way that you can inductively infer meaning from text. Right? That's just a contradiction in terms of doing interpretation. So really, yeah, if to illustrate the point beyond reasonable degree, yeah, if you don't know this person and she says like that, you're going to go on the literal meaning. That's basically the only background information you have. You know English, right? But if you know this person, you know what she is like, so you know that when she says that, she actually means this. But that's no way of getting at that hidden meaning without actually already knowing something. Yeah. Yeah. Let's. The end point is basically that understanding arises only against the backdrop of previous background knowledge. Right. We call that in hermeneutics, that's called pre-understanding. And since all observations are interpretation in this sense, there is basically no inductive science. Can qualitative research instead be hypothetical deductive? Yeah. And I think it can. How can it be that? Well, this is an example again from what my students have done, doing an interview study on internet poker. Why do people get addicted to that? And well, if they followed the procedures recommended, you don't read up on literature, you just go and talk to people, ask them, then the hypothesis comes from the interviews. Exaggerating slightly. But they said, well, when I said, well, look at the background literature, and they said, well, there is no one has investigated internet poker. And then we said, well, what other kind of activities do we get addicted to? Maybe there's a clue there. We look at research on drugs, and music, and bungee jumping, or just dangerous things generally, or sports, all things that people get addicted to. Why do they become addicted? And some of the things that came up were sensation seeking. They want the thrill of losing $1 million, or maybe it's flow. They want get this feeling of flow that you're just playing and playing. You don't think it just goes automatically. Beautiful feeling, many people say, right? Or they're just people who want to be with the actions. You come up with these possibilities, and you do that not by doing the investigation, but researching previous research. Okay. And then question is, how do we go about this hypothetical deductively? Well, you wonder how do we ask about how do you ask, for instance, about flow? We don't ask people outside, do you experience flow? And they say, what? What's that? They don't know, because it's a theoretical term. So instead, you have to say, well, if it's flow, what should happen then? Well, they should have experiences of everything just happening automatically when they play. They should have experiences of losing, time just flies, right? And they don't know, they just suddenly wake up, where am I? That's what you experience when you experience flow. And you can ask about that. Do you ever experience this? And if they say, yes, that's always fantastic, then you have support for the idea that it's flow. But if they say, no, never. I always calculate my responses very thoroughly, and no, it's not flow. And then you falsify a hypothesis. Now this looks like tiny hypothetical deductive reasonings, right? Isn't it? Yeah. And the thing is that if you do this, you design your study in this way, you produce an interview guide that asks these questions, and then you just tick off yes, no, right? Then you already have a manual for the analysis, really. You can just ask, well, what from the transcript of the data you got, what question is this an answer to? Is it the yes or no? And then you already know how you're going to interpret it, yeah? And that means that you overcome what's supposed to be the main obstacle in qualitative research, is that you get a lot of data. It is qualitative and undifferentiated. And it's a huge mess getting out the themes and categories and all that. And here you have gone around that. You already have the themes and the categories. Now, it will be objected that, well, you're just controlling your mind too much. Now you're not going to see the surprising stuff. But I don't see that happening. You can still have a question that isn't asked to the respondent, but just, is there something that they say spontaneously that is an answer to none of the questions I have, but to some other question I didn't realize I needed to ask. Right? And you can also ask in a situation, can you think of something that I haven't asked that you think is relevant for this situation? And then you can discover the new material and so on. And if you do it like this, you can do 500 interviews or 1,000 perhaps. The analysis isn't, excruciating, and actually people have done it. It's not, the idea is that you shouldn't and that you can't, but actually people have done it, and they have analyzed it even statistically afterwards and been able to justify or generalize to a huge population. So because people have done it, it's strange to me that the popular idea is that you can't do it, because that's not the point here. And that, in a way, concludes this talk here. I've tried to say very quickly and dirty why ontology matters, for why the different disciplines are doing things differently. You shouldn't complain that they're not doing the natural science thing, because they can't. The conditions just aren't right. And it's not because they don't know that the other sciences are doing like other things. They just can't do it. But then again, there is, I think, maybe it's because they want to create a contrast. They're doing something very different from what the natural sciences are doing, or the quantitative science is doing, and then they exaggerate the differences, end up in a way misdescribing their discipline. Okay, that's my provocative statement here. At least that's a way of saying the similarities in the way that people think are greater than is often represented, and the ways in which there's depicted the contrast, I think, is unconvincing. There isn't a clear contrast between hypothetical, deductive, and inductive. Inductive and hermeneutic really don't match. So, yeah, I think we need to realize that we need to move it closer, and I hope to have said something to help you move things closer. But these are all, which you must know, controversial issues. But there is some literature already moving into this area. Yeah. So thank you, and welcome.